There is a number growing in the shadows of global finance that should terrify you. $307 trillion. That is the total debt held by governments, corporations, and households across the planet right now in 2025. To put that in perspective, the entire global economy, every good and service produced by every country on Earth in a single year, equals roughly $105 trillion. We owe 3 times more than we produce. 3 times. And here's what nobody is telling you. This is not new debt from a recent crisis. This is structural debt that has been building for decades, doubling every 10 years like clockwork, and it has reached a point where the mathematics say it cannot be sustained. In 1997, Japan held government debt equal to 90% of its economy. Economists said it was manageable. By 2010, that number hit 200%. Today it exceeds 260%. The Japanese economy has not grown in 30 years. In 2008, Greece held debt equal to 110% of its economy. By 2012, it hit 180%. The economy collapsed, banks froze, pensions vanished, unemployment hit 27%. In 2019, Argentina held debt equal to 90% of its economy. By 2020, they defaulted for the 9th time in their history. The currency lost 70% of its value in 2 years. 3 countries, 3 debt bombs, 3 explosions, and here's what should keep you awake at night. The United States currently holds debt equal to 123% of its economy. The United Kingdom sits at 101%, France at 112%, Italy at 144%. China, despite all the growth stories, carries total debt, including corporate and household, at over 300% of its economy. We are not approaching the danger zone. We are deep inside it. This is the story of how debt becomes a bomb, why every country thinks they can manage it, and why the mathematics say we are running out of time. And it is accelerating faster than anyone wants to admit. If you are worried about what this means for your savings, your retirement, your financial future, hit that like button and subscribe, because understanding what comes next is the only way to prepare for it. Before we look at where the debt bomb takes us, you need to understand what sovereign debt actually is. Not the version they teach in economics classes, the real version. When a government spends more than it collects in taxes, it borrows the difference by issuing bonds. These bonds are promises to pay back the money with interest at a future date. Investors buy these bonds because they are considered safe. Governments, unlike companies, can always raise taxes or print money to pay their debts. At least that is the theory. In small amounts, government debt is not just manageable, it is useful. Borrowing to build infrastructure, fund education, or weather a temporary crisis makes sense if the investment generates future growth that pays back the debt. But here is where it goes wrong. When debt grows faster than the economy, when borrowing becomes permanent rather than temporary, when the cost of servicing old debt requires taking on new debt, the mathematics change. You enter what economists call a debt trap. The debt trap works like this. Your economy grows at 2% per year. Your debt grows at 5% per year. Every year, debt becomes a larger share of your economy. Every year, more of your tax revenue goes to interest payments instead of services. Every year, you have to borrow more just to pay the interest on what you already owe. Eventually, you reach a point where the market loses confidence. Investors start demanding higher interest rates to compensate for increased risk. Higher interest rates make the debt more expensive. More expensive debt requires more borrowing. More borrowing increases the risk. And suddenly you are in a spiral you cannot escape. This is not theoretical. This is what happened to Japan, Greece, and Argentina. And this is what is happening right now to most of the developed world. The difference is scale. When Greece collapsed, it was a €250 billion problem that the European Union could contain. When the debt bomb detonates across multiple major economies simultaneously, there is no one large enough to provide a bailout. The system itself breaks. Let me show you how this played out 3 times before, in 3 different countries, under 3 different circumstances, following the exact same pattern. Let us start with Japan in the 1,990 seconds and 2000s. This is the slow motion debt bomb. After World War II, Japan rebuilt itself into an economic miracle. By 1989, Japan was the 2nd largest economy in the world. Tokyo real estate was worth more than all real estate in the United States combined. The Nikkei stock index hit 38,915. Japanese companies were buying Rockefeller Center and Columbia Pictures. The future looked limitless. And then the bubble burst. Stock prices collapsed by 60%. Real estate values dropped by 70%. Banks that had lent trillions against inflated asset values faced catastrophic losses. The government made a decision. Rather than let banks fail and allow a painful but quick recession to clear the system, they would borrow and spend to cushion the blow. They bailed out banks. They launched massive infrastructure projects. They cut interest rates to zero. They borrowed to keep zombie companies alive. In 1991, Japanese government debt equaled 65% of the economy. By 2000, it hit 140%. By 2010, 210%. Today, it exceeds 260%. For 34 years, the Japanese government has run deficits, borrowed constantly, and accumulated debt that now equals 2.5 times their entire annual economic output. And what did they get for it? Economic growth has averaged less than 1% annually for 3 decades. Wages have been flat since 1997. The population is aging and shrinking. Young people cannot afford families. The Nikkei stock index only returned to its 1,989 peak in 2024, 35 years later. Japan avoided the immediate crisis of bank failures and mass unemployment, but they traded acute pain for chronic stagnation. An entire generation has lived their entire working lives in an economy that does not grow, cannot grow, because it is buried under debt that can never be repaid. Here is the critical detail. Japan can sustain this only because Japanese citizens buy 90% of government bonds. The debt is internal. They owe money to themselves. But even this has limits. As the population ages, retirees will need to sell bonds to fund retirement. When sellers outnumber buyers, interest rates will rise. And when interest rates rise on 260% debt to the economy ratio, the interest costs alone will consume the entire government budget. Japan has not solved their debt problem. They have merely delayed the reckoning. And the longer the delay, the more catastrophic the eventual adjustment. Now let us look at Greece from 2009 to 2015. This is the fast debt nation. Greece joined the European Union in 1981 and adopted the euro in 2001. Suddenly, a country that previously borrowed at high interest rates because of inflation risk could now borrow at German interest rates. It was like giving a credit card with a low interest rate to someone with a history of maxing out high interest cards. The Greek government went on a borrowing spree. They expanded the public sector. They hired hundreds of thousands of government workers. They built infrastructure for the 2004 Olympics. They offered generous pensions. They increased social spending. And they hid the true scale of borrowing through accounting tricks that understated the deficit. By 2009, the global financial crisis exposed the truth. Greece had been running deficits of over 10% of the economy for years. Total debt had hit 129% of the economy. And the deficit numbers they had reported to the European Union were fabricated. They were actually twice as high as claimed. When the truth came out, the bond market panicked. Interest rates on Greek bonds spiked from 4% to over 30%. At 30% interest rates, the debt becomes unpayable. The government could not borrow new money. They could not roll over maturing debt. They faced immediate default. The European Union and International Monetary Fund stepped in with bailout loans of 240 billion euros. But the bailout came with conditions. Greece had to cut government spending by 30%. They had to slash pensions. They had to fire government workers. They had to raise taxes. They had to sell state assets. The results were catastrophic. The economy contracted by 26% from 2008 to 2016. Unemployment hit 27%. Youth unemployment exceeded 50%. Pensions were cut by 40%. Thousands of businesses closed. The best educated young people left the country. Suicide rates increased by 37%. And after all that pain, after a decade of depression-level economic contraction, Greece still carries debt equal to 166% of the economy. They have not escaped the debt trap. They have merely survived inside it by accepting permanent economic diminishment. Greece today has an economy smaller than it was in 2001. 2 decades of supposed progress were erased. That is what happens when the debt bomb detonates, and you do not have the ability to print your own currency. This brings us to Argentina from 2015 to 2023. This is the recurring detonation. Argentina has defaulted on its debt 9 times since independence. 9 times. They have lived through hyperinflation multiple times, most recently in 1989 when inflation hit 3,000% annually. You would buy groceries in the morning because prices would be higher in the afternoon. Despite sitting on some of the richest farmland on Earth, despite vast natural resources, despite a well-educated population, Argentina has spent a century cycling between boom and bust, borrowing and default, stability and chaos. The pattern is always the same. A new government comes to power promising change. They borrow internationally to fund spending. Growth returns for a few years. Debt builds up. Eventually, they cannot pay. They default or devalue the currency. The economy collapses. They restructure the debt. A new government comes to power promising this time will be different, and the cycle begins again. In 2015, Argentina held debt equal to 53% of the economy. By 2018, debt hit 86%. By 2020, they defaulted again, the 9th time in their history. Why does this keep happening? Because Argentina uses debt not for investment but for consumption. They borrow to fund current spending, to subsidize industries, to keep pensions high, to maintain a large public sector. The borrowing does not generate growth that pays back the debt. It generates temporary comfort that ends in crisis. When the crisis hits, they have two choices: default on the debt and face years locked out of international credit markets, or print money to pay the debt in devalued currency, which triggers inflation that destroys savings and wages. Usually they do both. They default on some debt and inflate away the rest. And then 10 years later they do it again. Argentina today, under new leadership, elected in 2023, is attempting shock therapy. Massive spending cuts, elimination of subsidies, devaluation of the currency. The peso has lost 70% of its value. Inflation hit 211% in 2023. Poverty has increased to over 50% of the population. Will it work this time? The mathematics say it depends on whether they can generate real economic growth before the social and political system collapses under the weight of the adjustment. Argentina is the warning of what happens when you refuse to make hard choices early. The debt bomb keeps rebuilding and detonating, each time destroying a little more of the foundation, until eventually there is nothing left to rebuild on. 3 countries, 3 debt bombs, 3 explosions. Japan chose slow stagnation. Greece endured fast collapse. Argentina keeps cycling through repeated crises. Each believed their situation was unique. Each believed they could manage the debt. Each learned the same lesson. Once debt crosses certain thresholds relative to economic size, once the growth rate of debt exceeds the growth rate of the economy, once borrowing becomes necessary just to service existing debt, the mathematics take over. And the mathematics do not care about intentions or exceptionalism or hopes. The mathematics care about ratios and growth rates and compounding. And the mathematics say that unsustainable debt eventually stops being sustained. Now, let us talk about the global situation in 2025 and why every warning light is flashing red. The United States holds $36 trillion in government debt. That is 123% of the economy, higher than at any point except the end of World War II. But there is a critical difference. In 1945, debt was high because of temporary war spending. After the war ended, spending dropped, the economy boomed, and the debt ratio fell without ever being repaid. The debt stayed the same. The economy grew faster. Today, the debt is structural. It comes from permanent spending on Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, defense, and interest on the debt itself. These are not temporary programs that will end. These are promises that grow every year as the population ages. The Congressional Budget Office projects deficits of $2 trillion annually for the foreseeable future. That means the debt will hit $40 trillion by 2027, $50 trillion by 2030, and $70 trillion by 2040. At current interest rates of roughly 4.5%, interest payments already exceed $1.2 trillion annually. That is more than the entire defense budget. By 2030, interest payments will exceed $2 trillion, becoming the largest single item in the federal budget. Here is why this matters. When interest costs consume an ever larger share of the budget, there is less money for everything else. Either you cut spending on defense, Social Security, and Medicare, or you raise taxes dramatically, or you borrow even more. Cutting spending on programs with powerful political constituencies is nearly impossible. Raising taxes enough to close a $2 trillion annual gap would require increasing tax revenue by 30%, which would crush economic growth. So the choice becomes borrow more. But borrowing more makes the problem worse. More debt means more interest costs, means more borrowing, means more debt. Just like Japan, just like Greece, just like Argentina. Check. The United Kingdom carries government debt equal to 101% of the economy. After Brexit, after COVID spending, after energy subsidies to combat price spikes, the UK is running deficits of 5% of the economy during normal economic times. In September 2022, when the government proposed unfunded tax cuts, the bond market rebelled. Interest rates spiked. The pound crashed. The Bank of England had to intervene to prevent pension funds from collapsing. The government reversed the tax cuts within weeks. The bond market had effectively vetoed fiscal policy. That is what happens when debt gets high enough. You lose control. The market decides what you can and cannot do. Just like Greece discovered in 2009. Check. France holds debt equal to 112% of the economy and runs deficits of 5% annually. The government has tried to reform pensions to reduce future costs. The response was mass protests that paralyzed the country for weeks. The political system cannot make the hard choices necessary to control the debt. So the debt keeps growing, just like Argentina cycling through crisis after crisis because the political will to fix the problem never materializes until it is too late. Check. Italy carries debt equal to 144% of the economy. They have not had a sustained period of economic growth since joining the euro in 1999. An entire generation has come of age in a stagnant economy with youth unemployment perpetually above 30%. The debt is unpayable, everyone knows it. But Italy is too large to bail out like Greece and too politically connected to be allowed to fail. So the European Central Bank quietly buys Italian bonds to keep interest rates low. This works only as long as the European Central Bank maintains credibility. If inflation forces them to stop, Italian interest rates will spike and the debt will become explicitly unpayable rather than just quietly unpayable, just like Japan surviving only because their own citizens buy the bonds. When that changes, the system breaks. Check. China presents the most complex and potentially most dangerous debt situation. Official government debt sits at 83% of the economy, which appears manageable. But that number excludes local government debt hidden in off-balance sheet financing vehicles. It excludes corporate debt, much of it held by state-owned enterprises that are really extensions of government. It excludes household debt that has exploded as real estate prices quintupled over 15 years. When you add it all together, total debt in China exceeds 320% of the economy, 320%. And it is backed by a real estate sector that accounts for 30% of the entire economy, with property values based on the assumption that prices only go up. Since 2021, property values have dropped between 20 and 40% depending on the city. Major developers have defaulted. Construction has halted on millions of pre-sold apartments. Home buyers are refusing to pay mortgages on unfinished units. Local governments that funded themselves by selling land to developers have lost 70% of their revenue. The entire model was build apartments, sell them at higher prices, use the revenue to fund more building, assume prices keep rising forever. It is the same model that destroyed Japan in 1991 and the United States in 2008. And China is running the same playbook at 5 times the scale. The Chinese government is trying to manage the deflation slowly, letting some developers fail while propping up others, injecting liquidity while avoiding full bailouts. But they face the same impossible mathematics. If they let the real estate sector fully correct, the collateral backing 320% debt collapses and the banking system faces catastrophic losses. If they bail everything out, they end up like Japan, with debt that grows forever and an economy that stagnates for decades. There is no good choice, only less bad choices. And the window for less bad choices is closing. Check. We are not looking at one country with a debt bomb. We are looking at simultaneous debt bombs across most major economies. The United States, the United Kingdom, France, Italy, Japan, and China collectively represent over 60% of global economic output. If even 2 of these face debt crises simultaneously, there is no entity large enough to provide bailouts. The International Monetary Fund has $1 trillion in lending capacity. The debt in question is measured in tens of trillions. When Greece needed a bailout, the European Union could provide it because Greece was 3% of European economy. When Italy needs a bailout, Italy is 15% of European economy. There is no one to call. When Japan needs support, they are the 3rd largest economy in the world. Who bails them out? When China faces banking crisis from real estate collapse, they are the 2nd largest economy with the largest banking system on earth. There is no external rescue. And when the United States faces debt crisis, the United States is the global reserve currency, the foundation of the entire international financial system. If confidence in U.S. debt breaks, if the bond market decides that 123% debt ratio with $2 trillion annual deficits is unsustainable, there is no backstop. The Federal Reserve can print money to buy the bonds, but that triggers inflation that destroys the currency's purchasing power. The debt gets paid in devalued dollars. That is not avoiding crisis. That is choosing inflation crisis instead of default crisis. Either way, the debt bomb detonates. Here is what keeps me awake at night. We are not in the early stages of debt accumulation. We are in the late stages. Japan has been in the debt trap for 34 years. Europe has been managing serial debt crises since 2009. The United States crossed 100% debt-to-economy ratio in 2012 and has not looked back. China has been building its debt tower since 2008. This is not a new problem that we are catching early. This is an old problem that has been growing for decades, and we are approaching the point where the mathematics say time is running out. How do we know when time is up? We will know when interest rates rise and governments cannot afford to pay. We will know when bond auctions fail because there are not enough buyers. We will know when central banks have to print money to buy government debt because no one else will. We will know when inflation returns because printing money to pay debts always causes inflation. We will know when the currency declines because international holders of that currency start selling. Some of these signs are already appearing. The Bank of Japan intervened in currency markets in 2024 for the first time in decades to prop up the yen. The British gilt market required Bank of England intervention in 2022 to prevent collapse. The Federal Reserve printed $5 trillion from 2020 to 2022, and inflation hit 9%, the highest in 40 years. These are not theoretical future risks. These are current realities being managed day to day by central banks walking a tightrope. One side is deflation and depression. The other side is inflation and currency collapse. The tightrope is debt, and it gets thinner every year. 6 countries, 6 debt bombs, 6 simultaneous crises waiting to happen. Japan believed they could manage it with ultra-low interest rates forever. Britain believed their reserve currency history would protect them. France believed their social model was sustainable. Italy believed the European Union would always support them. China believed real estate prices would rise forever. America believed being the global reserve currency made them immune. They were wrong, every single time. History does not care about belief. History cares about mathematics. We are telling ourselves the same lies right now. We are different. We have the dollar. We have the euro. We have technology. We have central banks that can manage anything. We are too big to fail. But the pattern does not care about size or technology or reserve currencies. The pattern cares about debt growing faster than the economy. The pattern cares about interest costs consuming larger shares of the budget. The pattern cares about borrowing to pay interest on previous borrowing. And the pattern says that once you cross certain thresholds, once debt exceeds 120% of the economy while running permanent deficits, once interest costs exceed 15% of the budget, once political systems cannot make the necessary adjustments because the pain is too great, the mathematics take over. You cannot borrow your way out of a debt crisis. You cannot print your way out without destroying the currency. You cannot grow fast enough to outrun debt that is compounding faster than the growth rate. The only solutions are default, which destroys creditors, or inflation, which destroys savers, or brutal austerity, which destroys the economy and the social fabric. There is no painless option. There is only the choice of who bears the pain and when. And the longer you wait to make that choice, the worse all the options become. Japan waited and got 3 decades of stagnation. Greece waited and got depression. Argentina has waited repeatedly and gotten crisis after crisis. The major economies of the world are waiting right now, hoping something will change, hoping growth will return, hoping technology will save them, hoping the debt will somehow become manageable without hard choices. But hope is not a strategy. And time is running out. Maybe we have 5 years before the next crisis. Maybe 10, maybe less. But the pattern says the crisis is coming. And when it comes, it will not be contained to one small country that the system can rescue. It will be systemic. Multiple major economies facing debt crises simultaneously, with no one large enough to provide bailouts, with central banks forced to choose between deflation and inflation, with currencies losing value, with savers and retirees discovering their lifetime of work bought less than they thought. The debt bomb is not a future threat. It is current reality. The only question is when it detonates and how many economies it takes down when it does. If this changed how you see the global economy, if this helped you understand why the next crisis might be different from previous ones, hit that like button and subscribe. Because when the debt bomb detonates, when interest rates spike and currencies fall and governments face impossible choices, you will want to understand what is happening and why. The answers are not hiding in the future. They are written in the mathematics, and I will show you where to look.